Thank you, and thanks, Daniel. I don't know where you are. Oh, right there. Hi. Thank you for that great introduction. You have saved me from having to introduce any of that. So, my name is Mega. I'm a doctoral candidate here in the department, and I'm going to talk about how we can use transportability, so some of the methods Daniel was alluding to make subgroup analyses from trials more useful for informing how we prioritize interventions. Okay. Oh, nice. Okay, so subgroup analyses have long served as sort of a first step in thinking about how interventions should be implemented. And they're often used to think about who would benefit the most from a new intervention, who might be harmed, and they often play a big role in cost-effectiveness analyses of various flavors. So they end up playing a big role in policy decisions. But as we now know, trial populations rarely, if ever, resemble the target populations that we intend to implement an intervention in. And so this has several implications, not least of which is that it's hard to directly interpret the results of subgroup analyses for implementation purposes. And in fact, often they might be misleading. So I'm going to talk about a PrEP example as well to illustrate and motivate this issue. As we've now heard a few times, I'll be talking about Truvada for PrEP, and we know that it is highly efficacious, particularly when used consistently, but adherence is variable. And so the WHO has recommended PrEP for indication. It's been indicated for all at-risk individuals, but its implementation throughout the world is also very variable. Okay. So I'm specifically going to talk about the PrEP study here. So the PrEP study enrolled 2,499 MSM and trans women, and they were enrolled from 7 countries around the world. And the primary intention to treat analysis found that randomization to the active arm was associated with a 44% reduction in HIV incidence among those randomized to PrEP compared to placebo. However, subsequent subgroup analyses of the trial found that trans women enrolled in the study did not benefit from randomization to PrEP. And this was likely due to lower drug concentrations driven by adherence issues, but it's actually still a bit of an open question as to what happened. So PrEP, so what does this actually tell us about PrEP for trans women? And should we be making policy decisions based on this single subgroup analysis? In the context of limited resources, should we be prioritizing all of our adherence support interventions to trans women over MSM? And do we know anything about whether PrEP is cost effective in trans women? So there are many problems with this kind of line of thinking, not least of which is the fact that the PrEP study population was really more of a collection of many different populations all over the world. And so we know just by looking at this map here, these were all the study sites and countries. So we know just by looking at this map here that the PrEP study population as a whole is definitely not representative of any particular target population that we might be interested in implementing the intervention in. And so what do we do? PrEP was and still is the only placebo-controlled trial of Truvada for PrEP that included any trans women. So it's not like we can go back and do another placebo-controlled RCT, and not that we would want to. But so we have to do the best with the data, do the best that we can with the data that we have. And so I'm going to talk about how we can use some of these transportability, external validity methods to ask the question of what would my results from PrEP have looked like had the study been conducted in a population that more closely resembles my target population. And so this is an illustrative example that I'm going to use here, using data from the Latino MSM community involvement study, which is just a kind of hypothetical target population here. And so this study included 473 Latino MSM and trans women, 210 were in San Francisco and 263 participants enrolled in Chicago. And I'm only including the HIV negative participants from this study. There were HIV positive people also included. Participants were recruited from using respondent-driven sampling. And then everyone was asked to complete a CASI interview where they were asked questions about sexual behavior, substance and alcohol use, HIV testing history, and various demographic characteristics. So I'm going to use the San Francisco and Chicago sites as two different target populations here. So I'll be transporting the results from IPREX to two different cities as if they are two different hypothetical target populations. Okay. So the question that we're really trying to answer here is, what would the effect heterogeneity between trans women and MSM have been had the IPREX trial been conducted in each of these two target populations? And I'm going to go through a tiny bit of notation. Oh, first I'm going to talk about selection diagrams, which are almost like the causal DAGs that Daniel showed you, but they're ever so slightly different. So this selection diagram represents my kind of assumptions about the causal structure and the variables that I think matter here. So I have A is treatment assignment, Y is incident HIV infection. I'm ignoring adherence here because we didn't have adherence measured in everybody in IPREX. So I'm just going to use, it's essentially just kind of this unmeasured part of this edge here. G is gender, and W is a vector of baseline covariates that include age, education, number of partners in the past 6 months prior to the survey, preferred sexual role, and alcohol use. So this is where the selection diagrams differ a little bit between from here to the causal DAGs, but it's not really that important. These selection nodes are kind of like on and off switches, and they really just indicate where I think that the populations differ. Okay, so a little bit of notation. So I use S equals 0 to denote the target populations and S equals 1 for the IPREX study population. G equals 1 is for MSM, and G equals 0 is for trans women. So therefore, the average causal effect of randomization to PrEP in the IPREX study population is delta 1 here. And I define effect heterogeneity as in the study population across strata of gender as psi 1. And then the analogous formula in the target populations are delta 0, and our target parameter is then psi 0, which is the effect heterogeneity in the target population on the additive scale. Okay, so Daniel already mentioned these assumptions, but to make them a little bit more concrete for this particular question, we have to assume these two main assumptions, which I'm calling population exchangeability. I think the terminology here is a little bit fluid depending on who you talk to, which is analogous to S admissibility. And so that's really just saying that after we account for gender and all those baseline covariates, the target and trial populations are exchangeable. The next assumption is population positivity, which is that every strata, all the covariates within strata of gender and, all the combinations of covariates within strata of gender that exist in the target population have to be represented in the study population. And then, so given those assumptions and given the selection diagram, my target parameter is then identified by this. And I'll use Daniel's inverse odds of selection weights combined with as a weighted Poisson regression to transport the IPREX results to each of the two study populations. This is the weights formula here. Okay, and so here are the results, which intentionally don't have numbers on it because it's not really the point. Well, it has very few numbers on it. So the left side are the, oh, mouse. Okay, so the left side are the IPREX results. And you can see that the point estimates were different. The confidence intervals were wide, of course, but these were the findings of the IPREX study. But when we transport to both the Chicago and the San Francisco target populations, we see the point estimates become much closer. And so I don't want to dwell on these specific numbers because there are lots of caveats with these data. The target population, our data come from 2004, so it actually makes no sense that we'd be transporting backwards in time. This was really more of a way to illustrate the method and to show that, you know, we didn't really, the iPrEP study results don't really look like what we expect if we were to have transported given these covariates. And so it's hard to know without actually going through the work of transporting from your study population to a target population. It's hard to know what exactly your subgroup analyses tell you. So using that information to target an intervention is a little bit, I think, a little naive, but it's halfway there. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all I have. So I'm going to stop.